Hello, group. Sorry I could not make it today. I severely sprained my ankle and I'm not going to show you. It's ginormous. Okay, this is a little odd. Okay, so my chapter was chapter 20, The Sociolinguistics of Sign Languages, by C.L. Lucas, Robert Bailey, and Arlene Blumenthal Kelly. I'll email you guys this form, but to start it off, the general info, what was this chapter about, include any lit review background info. Chapter 20, The Sociolinguistics of Sign Languages, covered deaf culture, school learning, and the application of ASL, or how ASL was applied to educational settings, the discrimination against the deaf culture, and it had two different clinical applications, which I'll go into later. This chapter managed to cover the personal side of ASL, so the community and the people involved, as well as the history and the lack of research. And this chapter brought to light the previous assumptions made by researchers and how their outlook on ASL as a language has changed. So the main points that I want you guys to get are these assumptions that the researchers had prior to what is more recently known as ASL as a language. So going into the clinical information, The Sociolinguistics of Sign Languages is an interesting read because of how recent the majority of these findings in this field are. The 1970s was when they started educating ASL in the classroom. I found that unfathomable. Let's see. The deaf community has been limited and molded by four interrelated considerations, and these are the four main points of this chapter. They compared sign language to the spoken language, which, for example, was teaching deaf children English in school rather than teaching them ASL. And so that would be the first one. They compared the two languages together rather than looking at it as its own spoken language. Let's see. The second one is the lack of researchers' knowledge in the linguistic structure of sign language. So they didn't understand the patterns of sign language, the structure. Basically, if you don't know anything about a language, you can't study it. So they didn't know anything about the language at the time. Let's see. The big one, the doubt that sound language should be considered a real language. And the fourth one is applying spoken language sociolinguistic models to sign language. Rather than creating models specifically for ASL, they used language-specific English models. Okay. So starting with education, the chapter mentions how American deaf education began in order to teach English, not ASL. So that's what I was mentioning before. Rather than focusing on the language that these children are going to be using for the rest of their lives because they cannot hear, they focused more on teaching them English than sign. Awesome fact, sign languages have the same patterns of spoken language in the fact that bilingual signers will code switch between two languages, which people will do throughout dialects. People will do this in English as well. They borrow lexical signs, so they'll take signs from different languages and incorporate them into their own. There's foreigner talk and pidgins. All of these things happen in normal language, although previously they had not seen ASL as a language. Deaf culture was very important, is still very important, because children started going to deaf schools, which would culturize them and give them socialization skills, and they ended up making better friendships and relationships with the people they met in school than their families. And an interesting point they brought up in this chapter is that, let me read this for you. As with any minority group, in-group support is crucial for survival in the dominant culture. The experience of communication barriers with members of the dominant culture unites deaf people, regardless of their birth origin. Most often, deaf people have closer ties to other deaf people than to their own kin. For example, family holidays such as Thanksgiving, Christmas, and Passover may be times of celebration, but for most deaf people, they are often sites of frustration and oppression. Most hearing relatives do not know ASL, and deaf people often resort to watching television, reading, and leaving early. So, the deaf culture is very important to ASL because, as well as making friendships, they, before the 1970s, would teach each other ASL if one of the deaf children did not have a parent who taught them ASL at home. So it would start with a parent teaching their deaf child ASL, and then that deaf child would go to school and teach another child how to use ASL because there was no structure in the education system to teach them this language. So that's another interesting fact here. So you'll be able to read through all of this. I just wanted to get out the important things I found. The large-scale study that they studied in 2001 was about the variant deaf. And I write it in all capitals because that's how you would write a word in sign. So when you sign something, so this would be deaf. There are multiple variants of how to do that. Although in 1,618 samples, they only found 3 different variations. And so their study, their sociolinguistic study, was regarding which sign was used and whether there were any factors that played into that, like, your ethnicity, your social economic status. This was the interesting part, that ethnicity, gender, language background, and social economic status had no statistical factors regarding which sign was used. One of the only reasons that they found to change using certain signs was the age of the signer, and they correlate this back to the fact that before the 1970s, sign was not taught as a language to children in school, so the only variant would be people who were taught ASL before it was put into the education system. Okay, what did I like about this chapter? I liked learning about things that were really recent, and I got pretty fired up about the fact that the 1970s is when children were taught this language. Rather than teaching children the easiest, most socially helping language, which would be ASL, something that they can speak with people, rather than trying to force them to speak English, although they cannot hear themselves. They did that until the 70s. I'm just still enthralled by that. I found this chapter enlightening and easy to read. If you want to read it, it actually is really easy to read. It doesn't take more than 15 minutes. And there are also some examples of how to sign, and these are the 3 different variants of deaf that they did in the study. It was an interesting read, so I will email this to you guys, but my 3 questions to start the discussion. What reasons could cause the ethnicity, gender, language background, and social economic status to have no statistical factors regarding which sign was used? So if you're comparing this to American English and use, anyways, so, that's embarrassing. Do you think that there is less judgment within the deaf community because they cannot use certain signs to judge a person's economic status or gender? So if there is no variant and there is no pattern that you use a certain sign of deaf to use the word deaf, doesn't have anything to do with your status or anything, how are people going to judge you? Is there less judgment within the community? Does it make people more open? What do you think that could be a good side effect of that, I guess? So you guys can talk about that. And what are some other groups that you can think about that even have as close to a tight community as the deaf community? So that was my 10 minutes, and ta-da!